Hello and welcome to another episode of the Silk and Steel podcast. I'm your host, Carl Zha. Today, back on our show, we have Dana Burton, aka Showtyme, from Shanghai, China. Dana, there's a topic you have always wanted to talk about, and you wanted to talk about Malcolm X and his relationship with China. So let's go. Let's do this.
Yeah, thanks again for having me on the show. This is a topic that's really dear to my heart. For your new viewers, my name's Dana Burton, aka Showtime. I'm from Detroit, Michigan, a long-term resident of the People's Republic of China. And I actually was inspired by Malcolm X to come to China. The things that I read, Malcolm spoke about, that I think it doesn't get enough attention, even from some of the most disciplined Malcolmites. I was talking to a young South African here in Shanghai a couple of days ago, and they're really interested in how I came to the decision to move to China. And I talked about being inspired by Malcolm X, and uh, they asked me. They said, "Okay, well, if you were so deeply inspired to come to China because of Malcolm X, why aren't there more African Americans that love Malcolm X coming to China for the same reason?" And I thought that was a really good question. They're like, "Are you special or something? Like, what is it?" But I genuinely believe that um, I was an extreme Malcolmite. I hung on every word. I researched anything and everything I could about this man's life. And it's been a lifelong passion. I continue to do it. I'm part of a group. We meet every week and we study Malcolm X. And I've been part of this group on Clubhouse for over 3 years. And I've just been studying him incessantly, particularly since the mid 1990s. So if there's any, you know, figure in history that I've studied the most, it would be Malcolm. And he's been talking about Asia and China for a long time. And when I was on your show the first time, I just kind of gave a broad overview. I talked about the connections that China had to his life and his personal life. I talked a little bit about his affinity for Chinese food. He talked about he learned about Chinese history while in prison and how that influenced him. And I began to set the stage for the discussion that I really want to have that leads into the research that I've been diving into for the past 5 years. And it goes into a theory of why Malcolm X was assassinated. And I suggest, based on the information that I have, you can make an argument. Malcolm X was assassinated by the CIA because of his relationship to China. And this is something we need that is very relevant for today, for the Black community, the Black American community, the global Black community, or anyone just moderately interested in Malcolm X. And I must, this is a disclaimer. This is a theory. This is an ongoing theory. There are allegations, but I want to provide the motive and as much much evidence as possible, and hopefully we can come to a concrete answer. And as I walk through the story and walk through the theory, I think it will inspire more scholars and intellectuals to actually pick up on what I'm suggesting. So that's the general
Wow.
crux of what I want to get at.
Yeah, this is actually a very explosive theory, and I am very interested to hear what you have to say. Maybe you can just give my audience a quick rundown.
Sure. So before I get into the meat and potatoes and outline of the theory, I just want to bring it back to a human level and a human connection, because uh, the I talked about in our first episode, Chinese Malcolm X's affinity for Chinese food, and later his like affinity for Chinese people and the people that he met. I believe this is really important to humanize the relationship and see the progress throughout his life, the deep connections with China. Because if you're paying attention, if you read the autobiography of Malcolm X, he randomly mentions Chinese food multiple times. He talks about when he's in Harlem and the Chinese food that he would eat there and the smells of it and the memories. And this all relates to, how he started to get this connection with China. And again, when he went in prison, um, he studied Chinese history a lot. They had a profound effect upon him. And this will all make uh, more clear the connections that he had, the connections with the people, the history that he aligned with that I think is missing. But I'm gonna put up this book because this is Seventh Child, Malcolm X by Rondell P. Collins, who was a nephew of Malcolm X. He was the son of Malcolm's bigger sister. I believe it was his father's firstborn from a previous marriage. I think he had three children before he had about six children with his second wife, who was the mother of Malcolm X. And this woman, Ella Collins, was a big mentor to Malcolm. Like when Malcolm's parents died, well, first when his father died, and then later his mother was sent to insane asylum. He was pretty left alone. The kids were pretty much orphans, and his bigger sister had already moved to Boston and had established herself. And she was the first one who had a deep connection with Malcolm's father. Malcolm's father was a preacher. He was a Garveyite preacher. He spread the message of Black liberation and nationalism across the country. And as a child, uh, he would take Ella Collins with him to these sermons and sit next to him when he would preach. And so she really inherited, the spirit of Malcolm's father. And later, he separated from his first relationship and kind of abandoned that family, went on with Malcolm's mother and had, I forgot the total number right now, or 6 to 8 children with her, with Louise Little. I needed to get these facts right. But Malcolm was the seventh son. He was the seventh child. He was the third child of Louise Little, and the fourth child of Louise Little, and uh, he had three previous children. So he was the seventh son of his father. And when his father passed, uh, Ella Collins, his older sister, came back into his life and kind of filled that void as a father figure, like the head of the siblings, and got Malcolm and brought him to Boston. So he brought him to Boston, Massachusetts, where she had found a way to establish herself. Half of her family from the South, they already had got into buying property. So she was good. That side of the family had bought property and knew how to bought and resell property, just like her Malcolm's father did. He was always building his own home on this land, and they had that skill set. So she had a little bit of assets. She was I think she was a secretary for Adam Clayton Powell as well. She was very active. But to make the long story short, to bring this all back to China, what is the connection? It's when she brought him from Lansing, Michigan, to try to woo him to come to Boston. Actually, she invited all of the family, many of the siblings, to come live with her. And when he had this connection of coming to Boston, there was a China connection involved. And I just discovered this just by reading this book multiple times. But when she first brought Malcolm, they wanted to set him up with a job. And the job that they set him up with was in Chinatown. It was in Boston's Chinatown. So this is a transition period in his life. I'll read a little bit from the book. Since Ma, that is Ella Collins, Malcolm's biggest sister, didn't believe in wasting time. By Uncle Malcolm's second day in Boston, she was already getting down to business because she had a strong belief in the work ethic as anyone you can imagine. That meant he had to get a job. Therefore, her first task was to take Uncle Malcolm downtown to meet John Walker Sr., her uncle by marriage, who owned Walker's Auto Parts Company Auto Parts Company, a parking lot business located in Boston's Chinatown. So Uncle Malcolm and his senior took him to immediately liking each other. So this is a big transition period. This is also where people say kind of Malcolm started to go a bit wayward. He came up to Boston. He moved in. He started dancing, hanging out in the streets. He started, getting involved with drugs. He learned to get on the train and take the train to Harlem and get into the drug scene. And later he would get arrested in Boston. But it's very interesting that he lived or he went to work in Chinatown. And so he did have proximity to the Chinese community, and he started to meet people and network with them and learn a little bit about their life and lifestyle. Um, and what's also interesting to show you, maybe why he had an affinity for Chinese food, and it keeps coming up. The second day that he was in Boston, the entire family got together to have like a big welcoming dinner for Malcolm and to get the family together and to introduce him to the other side of his family that he lost connection with. And what's really amazing, you would think that, all right, big family dinner, well, he's probably going to have a soul food restaurant. There's going to be some collard greens and chicken. They're all going to get together. No, they took him to a Chinese restaurant to celebrate this moment. And I'll read the passage. It says, on the evening of Malcolm's second day in Boston, he, Ma, and several other family members celebrated with a dinner at Gordon and Anita Cho's restaurant in Chinatown. To us, Malcolm's coming to live permanently with us was a special kind of homecoming. Ma said, we wanted to celebrate as a family. Cho's restaurant was the perfect place. Since they and the Walkers were good friends, Malcolm got his first taste of Chinese food and greeted several family members whom he hadn't met on his first trip to Boston. And what this may imply, I'm going to do some more research on it because they were saying that Malcolm was employed in a parking lot business, and it's in Chinatown, and this restaurant was next to the business, and they were good friends. It may be they might have even used their parking lot to allow them, to have their business. So there was this symbiotic relationship that deserves to be explored. So I just wanted to start the whole thing off with a real human experience, like a people to people exchange, to humanize it, because the rest of the story is going to go downhill pretty quick and it gets really dark. But maybe if you have some reactions or any thoughts about the framing of what I just put forward.
I'm looking forward to hear more.
All right, so let's get into it. Let's get down into the main thesis of my argument. The allegation is that Malcolm X was murdered by the CIA. I didn't make that allegation. There's a long list of people who argued that he was killed by the CIA. If you go back and look at the research on the assassination of Malcolm X, 99% of the research is focused on the Nation of Islam, their role and their involvement in the assassination of Malcolm X. A lesser extent is focusing on the FBI and Bossy. We find almost no information, no research, no in-depth study about the CIA involvement. You have some allegations, but no one is taking the research a bit further and looking into the details. And I find that extremely alarming because we have a long list of people that put forward the claim that Malcolm X was killed by the CIA. So the allegations are out there. Now, what would the motive be? So I've broken down the motive to two parts. One, Malcolm was jeopardizing a play, a strategy, an objective, a mission to destroy the Black community, to destroy and destabilize the leadership of the Black community domestically in the United States of America. There's an entire agenda and strategy to do that. and Malcolm posed a threat to that agenda. That's a domestic issue. That comes under the FBI. So what would the CIA have to do with this? What is their involvement as an entity that focuses on international organizations and international state actors and things outside of the United States? I'm going to illustrate to you why, because the second reason he was eliminated is because Malcolm X threatened the United States uh, national security interest, and he actually threatened an ongoing operation, an agenda for a clique within the deep state, uh, by the various state entities, primarily the CIA. And what is the connection between the domestic and the international objective? That connection is China. China is the common thread that connected both of the threats. And what is another common thread? That thread is the drug trade and the international drug trade, which aligned with uh, a twofold objective. That drug trade was being used to undermine uh, the Chinese Communist Party. It played a major role in the United States' strategic objective to keep the wars going on in South Asia and to be able to fund those wars. It all came from drug money. And what we saw happening is that drug money that was coming from Southeast Asia, that was coming up from these puppet regimes and these puppet anti-communist forces, also included international drug cartels and the triads. It was the triads and that were being backed by the United States via the KMT to go against the communists that were profiting from the drug trade. Elements within the United States military industrial complex wanted to keep that going because that was helping funding their support of the KMT. And there was a backlash because later they found that they could smuggle these drugs in that they were using to support the anti-communist forces. They could, smuggle those drugs into the United States and use that to destabilize the black community. By who? The mafia. The same people that they needed to counter communism in America. And so we're starting to see the hidden hand because Malcolm threatened the drug trade in Harlem on two fronts. One, he threatened the spread of drugs because he was actually educating and training people and waking them up and getting them off drugs. That was a no-no. But secondly, Malcolm had the audacity and the courage to educate people on the flow of drugs and where those drugs were coming from, which was coming from South Asia, which was coming to back those wars. And then when it gets to the international element, not only was he educating people in America to stop the Vietnam War, even before it was public, even before we even knew what was going on, Malcolm was the most outspoken critic of the Vietnam War. But he was actually coming into contact and aligning himself with those people, the Communist Party of China, who the United States was countering. So that's the big outline. That's the overall outline. And I'm sure you have a lot you want to chime in on this framework.
Well, there's an excellent book by American journalist Alfred McCoy called The Politics of Heroin, which actually detailed the U.S. military-industrial complex involvement in the drug trade in Southeast Asia. Particularly in areas of Golden Triangle between Thailand, Myanmar, and Laos, and how that financed various various operations off the book operations of CIA in Southeast Asia, and how they use mafia both in United States and elsewhere to do distribution. Like they the whole it's a highly recommended reading for everyone. You basically start by talking about how United States brought back mafia in Italy because mafia almost got wiped out by Mussolini. Uh, but United States needed the mafia to counter the communists, so they brought mafia back in Italy, and how the mobs were involved in transporting the drugs, into the United States from various areas in the world, and everything is all tied together. So I mean, this is, and we all know CIA is involved in introducing crack cocaine into the black community. That part has been, well documented, and the other part is of course to introduce opioids, heroin and etc. into to U.S. as well. So yeah, I mean, I think this is a very plausible, very plausible theory.
So let's get into some of the evidence. Let's look at some of these documents that most of them come from the redacted CIA files on Malcolm X, FBI and CIA files. So we just pull up whatever one. We don't have to go in order. We'll just go through each one to see what the document could illuminate in terms of the story. So this is the allegation. And this is the allegation coming from the Chinese themselves. When Malcolm X was assassinated, the Chinese came out publicly and stated that he was assassinated by the United States government. They were the first ones to call a spade a spade. They were the first ones to come out and publicly, this was published in the New York Times, February 22nd, 1965. The headline reads, China Reds say Malcolm X was slain by imperialists. They're talking about the United States directly. And I guess this is coming out of Hong Kong, the Hong Kong press, and the Beijing Daily, the Beijing newspaper. And it declared that the American, quote, ruling circles and racists murdered Malcolm X, whom it depicted as a martyr in the Negroes' fight against the U.S. reactionary forces. Okay, it's spelled Jiming Jinpao, the official organ of the Chinese Communist Party, declared in the editorial, the quote, from the Communist Party publication, the
I think
blood
they're
of
talking
Malcolm
about. I think they're talking about 人民日报, the People's Daily, which is like the
Zherbao.
official media of the Chinese state. Yeah.
Thank you. It means Zherbao. I think because they're using the Gabe Wiles pinyin.
Yeah.
I don't know what they're talking about. Okay, so the blood of Malcolm X will not have been shed in vain. American Negroes will undoubtedly realize from his murder that in dealing with the imperialist oppressors, violence must be met with violence, as Malcolm X himself taught. The editorial represented Malcolm X as an advocate of violence and said he had to become a thorn in the side of U.S. rulers. Quote, their murder of Malcolm X indicates that they are prepared to use any despicable means to intimidate American Negroes and quell their struggle, the paper said. And I'd be very interested to dig up the actual newspaper to get the full context of the quote. They want to frame it as, Malcolm X is an advocate of violence. That's the first thing they did after he died. But they were very explicit. This is violence in self-defense. He said you meet violence with violence. He's not advocating violence as a first measure or this advocate of aggressive assault or attack or any of this nature, but violence in self-defense. That you don't have to sit back and someone's murdering you and slaughtering you and not defend yourself. So he says you meet violence with violence. That's what he said precisely. But of course, the New York Times is definitely going to find a way to frame it and narrow it into this depiction of Malcolm, because he certainly was looking for any means necessary to help liberate and uplift his people, and he wasn't someone obsessed with revolutionary violence for the sake of violence itself. So that's the first um, evidence or first allegation coming from the Chinese themselves, acknowledging that he was killed by the state, by the U.S. state, and by the U.S. imperialists. So here's the next set of accusations. Very interesting, because this will start to give you the evidence to substantiate my argument that Malcolm X was assassinated because of the people he was in association with, who were directly involved with the Chinese and directly posed a threat to the United States foreign interests. So this is declassified papers from the CIA. The date is February 25th as well, 1965. And I'm really not sure exactly what this document is. It's some kind of write-up, and I'll read it. It's going to be clear who they're referring to. I'm just not clear exactly who typed this up, but it seems like some kind of a summary. But it says Malcolm X assassination protests, and the first thing is they list this group, and this will be pertinent. The AATUF accused American imperialists of the assassination of Malcolm X. So immediately after he's killed, this group that is based, a Pan-Africanist group based primarily in China, working in China, they come out and make the statement that Malcolm X was killed by the American imperialists. So a communique signed by the AATUF Secretary John Tetaga states, and we need to know who that man is. General John Tetaga states, through their deliberate and dastardly act, American imperialists have deprived Africa and the world of a sincere comrade whose name will go down in history and thus show the Africans' determination to survive. And this is coming from Bamako, Mali, domestic time, 7 o'clock GMT, February 24th, 1965. A delegate of 9 African nationalist parties, in a joint statement signed in Cairo, condemned the brutal assassination of the American Negro leader Malcolm X by the U.S. imperialists. The 9 parties signing the statement are the Basutoland Congress Party, the Bechuanaland Party, People's Party, the Swaziland Progressive Party, the Southwest African National Union, the People's Organization, the Pan-African Congress, the African National Congress, the Mozambique National Democratic Union, and the Zimbabwe African People's Union. Beijing, February 26, 1965. Quote, this is what they said collectively. Being defeated everywhere in the world, the U.S. imperialists are resorting to more desperate means of slaughter and murder, said Shirley Graham Du Bois, wife of the well-known late Negro scholar Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, commenting on the assassination of the African-American leader Malcolm X. A statement issued also by Julian Mayfield, African-American novelist who lives and works in Ghana, pointed out to the, quote, assassination of Malcolm X bears all the markings of a Central Intelligence Agency execution. There can be no room for doubt as to why Malcolm X had to be killed. The moral of the murder is that we must never underestimate the ruthlessness and brutality of American capitalism. Beijing, February 24th, 1965. So you have all of these Pan-Africanists, Black socialists, Marxist-Leninists, nationalist groups, most of them attending the conferences in Cairo, many of them deeply connected to China, which we're going to have to dig into in much more profound ways, because a lot of these groups, they were actually taking training in China. They were getting revolutionary training, military training, weapons training to defend themselves on the African continent. And Malcolm was in connection with these organizations and groups. He was in connection directly with Shirley Graham Du Bois, Julian Mayfield, when he was in Ghana, and he was directly in contact with the uh, Chinese embassy in Ghana at that time, which where I talked about in our last podcast on this topic, where he went to a banquet and he saw three films at the embassy. There was a party, and he met one of the most important Chinese diplomats. Ghana was meant to be the base for China's influence and connections with revolutionary African movements. Cairo was a sort of like the back end of the base. That was the place where they engaged with the African Union and other African groups. Later, I believe they started to shift more towards Tanzania. But this development is what threatened and shook the American powers to their core, and what the CIA was so furious about Malcolm about. And this is why they were tailing him and following him in China. And this is why Malcolm is always coming up in the FBI files. And later, I believe, when these new FBI and CIA files get redacted, we'll see that he was being heavily covered because of his connection with China and the Chinese Communist Party, and these connections here. But here's the allegation. Here's another piece of evidence that needs to be explored and looked into detail. What are your thoughts? What are your reaction? What are your comments?
Yeah, I mean, Malcolm, especially near the end of his life, he was making all sort of connections with the revolutionary movement in the global South, but particularly in Africa, and he was inspired by the Chinese Revolution, as he has said himself many times. So I can see how this can freak out the ghouls in the CIA and the American national security establishment.
They absolutely did not want to have any connection between African Americans or the Black community and their liberation struggle and Africans, and at that time, most critically, China. China was the biggest threat. It was the threat on the horizon. China was the state that they failed to conquer. They always wanted to colonize and dominate China. They failed at that operation, and to see China push back is what W.E. Du Bois said is the reason why China was so hated, and why the Americans put the Chinese outside of humanity. That was W.E.B. Du Bois's word, that they are less than human because we couldn't conquer them. And now that they are trying to share their techniques of guerrilla warfare, of resistance, to export that model and train that to Africans, we need to cut that off immediately. And that's what they did in Ghana. That's what they did, how they got Kwame Nkrumah out of there, by dislodging that connection. And that was the connection that Malcolm X was at the very nexus of, and made it so that he had to be eliminated. In addition to, as I mentioned before, the very complex relationship with the drug trade. So here's the next piece of evidence. And I talked about this guy, Victor Riesel, in our last podcast, and I think I misspoke. I was looking back at the podcast, and I saw your reaction because I said Victor Riesel followed Malcolm X to China. I think I misspoke and said that. Victor Riesel followed Malcolm X, but that's a Freudian slip, because Victor Riesel followed Malcolm X to Africa. He was tailing Malcolm X while he was in Africa, while he was meeting Chinese diplomats and Chinese, if you will, as today what they might say is influence operations. And so Victor Riesel, again, is very important, because this helps, go back to my theory. Victor Riesel was a guy who was infamous, and I need to flesh out and get his story correctly. But he was infamous for, he was a staunch anti-communist, and he was infamous for infiltrating the labor movements and being involved in the American labor movements and the role of the mafia in the labor movements. So he's a very murky figure who is doing all this investigative journalism into the mob, into the mafia. Obviously, it's going to overlap with communist movements in America, labor organizing, left wing movements, and the drug trade with the mafia guys. And so he's a guy on the ground, and this is how they sneak in with the journalists. It's the journalists that have this carte blanche access to information under the guise of journalism, doing investigative reporting, doing a public good. They can sneak into all of these communities and do their research and raise awareness in the public. And usually they end up being an asset for the state, providing the information to the in the intelligence community. And they also end up being an actor. They actually engage in forms of manipulation and coercion by spreading disinformation, leading people the wrong way, pitting different groups against each other. And I mentioned that, Riesel got famous because whatever he was doing with the mob and the labor unions, somebody came and threw some acid on him. So they threw acid on him, and he became a hero in the public as this brave journalist that survived an acid attack, and he wouldn't shut up. But here is Victor Riesel now following Malcolm X all the way to Africa. What the hell are you doing following a black man to Africa? What business is this of yours? And lo and behold, it's going to be fleshed out if you pay attention to the narrative that he's trying to paint and that I'm going to show you is these connections between the mob in Harlem that is getting the drugs allegedly from the CIA, from the military industrial complex, from the boats and the planes coming from the US military that's getting them from the Golden Triangle, that's using the drugs to fund their war against the Chinese communists in Vietnam, in Cambodia, in Laos, in China. They're using the drugs to fund the militias, but they're funneling some of that money because they just can't get enough, the greed, back to the United States. They're pocketing the money, and they're also funding the mafia to do the same thing to battle the communists. And so Victor Riesel, and he says in this later, he goes to Cairo, and the first thing he says, Malcolm X, whom the Chinese communists call chairman of the Afro-American Unity Organization. So at the beginning, he's telling you his target is the Chinese communists, and even says that the heading of this note is like he's supposed to be a labor investigator. It says Inside Labor is the name of this report, and the subtitle is Malcolm X calling for violence meets with communists in Cairo. And this is just showing you just like how simplistic the narrative is, and just in bullet points. He's telling you Malcolm X calling for violence. I just showed you how the New York Times, you got to put that in there. Malcolm's violent, and two, he's with the communists. That's it. That's the agenda. And it's the same agenda that they push today, that they don't flesh out and tell you what they're talking about. That's all they have to do is simplify. Malcolm X, violence, communists, eliminate him. That's the equation. Get him out of here. He's got to go. So he goes to Cairo, and he spent a considerable amount of time in the presence of international communist propagandists. That's the Chinese. That's who they're talking about. And he said he prepared a series of inflammatory anti-U.S. documents in the pretext of presenting them to the recent meeting of the OAU, and it was reported across the world. He attended the conference. This is nonsense, and this is when he starts to begin to discredit Malcolm. Said he followed him everywhere. Malcolm didn't meet with anyone important. No one, took Malcolm seriously. He says Malcolm was not at any of the conference sessions. I was informed that it was ridiculous and undignified to think for a moment that anyone such as Malcolm X would be heard by an African counterpart of the of the Organization of American States. So they are over there, and he's not the only one. They're sending agents to follow Malcolm to keep Malcolm from making real connections in Africa, and to stop him from building this new sort of post Bandung conference, global South alignment that we're seeing come to fruition today, of African and Latin American and Asian nations. And it goes down like this is the last. There's a second page, but we don't have to go through it now. But he says that Malcolm X's activity here was strictly a propaganda operation, which he set up at the Hotel Samarimi, which some newsmen gathered. He made certain that his violent anti-U.S. diatribe were put in the hands of the Chinese Communist correspondent planted here by the New China News Agency. And so, according to Victor Riesel, Malcolm's entire trip to Africa was a PR stunt to align with the Chinese. That's really what he's alluding to. But this is the third piece of evidence. What are your thoughts? How are you responding to this information, Carl?
Well, I mean, a lot of the so-called Western journalists, they're fully embedded with the U.S. government, acting as government informers or in some cases spies. So this is not really surprising.
That's that pattern. We're going to see the pattern again. And so here's another. Now this is the most damning piece of evidence where I believe a CIA asset leaked pretty much the plot and the narrative that really exposes the United States. It exposes the entire play. And we have the luxury of time, going back in time and looking at the consistency of how these attempts play out, how the CIA leaks these stories to misdirect you, to actually project what they are doing onto their adversary. They're literally telling you their playbook, what they're engaged in, what they're doing, but they project it on their adversary and to misdirect you. And they think that they can get away with it. But when we, critically analyze the narrative here, you're going to see immediately this is the exact same narrative that is happening today. The storyline hasn't changed. And there's not a single shred of credible evidence for what he's saying here to what's being said now. So this also came out. It says sanitized approval. This is by the CIA. It's not redacted. Released by Freedom of Information Act, February 25th, 1965. And this is the first time that I believe there may be others that the empire, if you will, tried to clean up the assassination of Malcolm. This is cleanup mode. He got assassinated. We want to cover our trail. We need to leak a story to the public to throw them off track, to get them looking in the right direction, to misdirect them. And the title of the article is Probe Red Dope Tie to Malcolm X Murder. Probe Red Dope Tie to Malcolm X Murder. And the story that they're trying to concoct is that the Chinese communists were dope dealers and that the communists are selling the dope. The communists are putting the dope in Harlem, in the Harlem community, and Malcolm was working with them. Malcolm was working with the Chinese communists somehow in this conspiracy, and somehow, some way, it got muddled and befuddled, and the communists wanted Malcolm dead, and so they assassinated him. It is the most bizarre thing in the world, and this is published by World Telegraph. What is this? I don't even know what this is. I have to look at on the World Telegraph staff. This is legitimate at the time, legitimate international news. This is like the few cables that we get at the time for that supplies all of the news in the US. Kind of like today we have Reuters, the one in France, APN News. We only have like three.
AP. Yeah.
Thank you.
Reuters, AFP, AP. Yeah.
So this is literally coming from, allegedly legitimate sources And I want to show you. You may have some things to say and weigh in on this, but this guy that wrote the article, I've tried to figure out who the hell he was. Who is this guy? Where did he come from? What is his credibility? I cannot find anything on him. I can't find a single thing about this guy except one very interesting lead that leads me to believe he's definitely a CIA asset. He's got all the classic characteristics because just like Victor Riesel, these guys, a lot of times these military ops, they have like specialization in China, in the mafia, but they can't talk about it. They have all this information, they can't come public with it. So after their career, one of the things that they do, they get into fiction and they write novels and stories, and they have these best-selling novels and stories. And you wonder, like, okay, where do these guys come up with this stuff? They have these incredible imaginations. No, actually, these guys are telling you the inside information that they got. They put it in fiction form, and that's how they're able to earn money from the grift from their career. They're providing facts, but they have to put it in a narrative form. Well, guess what? Guess who Paul Mescal is? Guess what he did? The only other published piece of work that I can find about this guy, I'm doing a terrible job, but uh, he wrote a book called, what is this thing that he wrote? Hitler's Heirs. Let's see if I can get up there more clear for you. Okay, I can see it. Hitler's Heirs. Where are they now? By Paul Mescal. And this thing came out on Pyramid Books. It's almost like a comic book. It's for 50 cents. You can pick this up at any comic book store. Let me see when the date when it was published. But this is something that's being circulated popularly. Kids can pick it up, 50 cents, a nickel. And the whole story of what he goes into is he argues that after the fall of Hitler and the National Socialist Party, that all of those members who were quote unquote Nazis were spread out all over the world, and that they're still in society today, and that they're still operating, engaging in fascism in all these different places, including New York, including Egypt, Europe, so on and so forth. And then he just takes you on this whole journey of how this narrative of how the West is still fighting fascism, and fascism is still alive, and it's in Africa, the new African corps, they're everywhere. But he has this like spy novel, and this it's a whole story into itself. But it is so outrageous and fantastic, this narrative. Yet this is the man that's writing the story for why Malcolm X was assassinated. I think you want to jump in. I can see your expression. You want to chime in.
No. I mean, this is fine, but I just like to say every accusation is a confession. Like a lot of the Western talking points on China is usually 100% projection. And speaking of Nazis, yeah, Nazis, of course, they still exist. They got put into NATO. A lot of Nazi generals became NATO commanders, and U.S. literally have this operation called Operation Paperclip to ship all these Nazi scientists to United States. That's how the U.S. space program got started. So, I mean, yeah, yeah. Of course, Nazis are they're still with us.
Yeah, it's really interesting the spin. I'm glad you brought that up because I think I don't know if he mentions it, but he is alluding to Operation Paperclip. But the way he frames it, it's so different. And then when you really think about it, yeah, he doesn't talk about the way that these actors were absorbed by the state to help the state, to benefit the state. He's spinning it to leave the argument that continues today that you hear in like the Democratic Party and in the centrist circles is that fascism is a lie. Fascism has penetrated our society. We've got to do everything to fight fascism, and they have you searching for these boogeymen that don't even exist while they're getting away actually leading the fascism. So it's this amazing bait and switch where, and it's just so interesting how the fascists are sprinkled all over all the countries of the world. So now the United States is justified in interfering in their affairs and their system because they're full of the real fascists. And it's just this typical bait and switch kind of narrative. But I wanted to go back so I could read a little bit from that red, probe document. It is kind of small. I'm gonna have to get up here and squint a little bit. This is gonna be kind of odd for your viewers, but the story is so salacious. Um, what does he say? He says that first of all, James Farmer is another important figure in this. A farmer was a member of CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, and that was a nonviolent kind of civil rights organization, very similar to the Urban League in some respects. And CORE later kind of got co-opted, if I have my facts straight, by the Republican Party and became sort of like this compatible left. And they put forward this kind of conservative black nationalism and black capitalism. And Farmer got caught up in some of that. But Farmer was also convinced that the gunmen that executed Malcolm X were not black Muslims. He believed that this was a cover up by the CIA, by the intelligence community as well. And he came out and spoke on that, and he's quoted in this. So they're kind of feeding into it. So on one end, Farmer is saying that Malcolm pointed out he had been deeply involved in fighting the Harlem drug traffic, and asked if he was aware that left wing extremists had been peddling dope to finance their revolutionary activities. So this is the journalist putting the spin on the story. They're trying to ask him as well, okay, Malcolm's trying to fight the drugs. Well, did you know that these left wing extremists were selling the drugs too? And then they kind of use Farmer to corroborate this narrative. Farmer says, quote, I've heard such reports. I think all angles should be looked into. So this is, no evidence, speculation, leading the witness to plant the narrative. And then it says, from other sources, the World Telegraph learned that Red China has been shipping heroin, cocaine, and other narcotics to Cuba for transshipment to the United States and Latin America. Smuggled into this country via Canada and Mexico, the dope has become the major revenue source of at least one Harlem-based extremist group.
This is at the same time when CIA is shipping in cocaine from Central America to Florida, handed over to the mobs to distribute into black community. And actually in the book I mentioned earlier, in Alfred McCoy's book, Politics of Heroin, he also talked about this projection, in the 1950s when Mao's China was cracking down on the opium production and opium trade inside China, that created a huge supply disruption. That's when CIA, in working with the KMT remnants in Myanmar, started their opium cultivation in Golden Triangle. And to explain this sudden new supply, emergence of new supply, at the time the U.S. drug czar, claimed, oh, this is because Mao is flooding the world market with opium, which is completely bogus and a 100% projection, because it was United States and through their proxies that was making the Golden Triangle, the major supply base of opioids all throughout the world. And they were bringing in through their mob connection. And they're trying to blame it on the Red China, when in fact Red China was cracking down on the opium cultivation, opium trade inside China. And so yeah, so this is just another example that how that carried over even to the 60s, as CIA itself start cranking up the transport of cocaine from Central America and South America into United States to specifically target Black communities.
And this is why this is so egregious and outright criminal, pathological. The mindset to come up with this type of narrative, to blame it on China, when at that time, if you look what happened next after Malcolm X passed away, and the sons of Malcolm X, later the Black Panthers, who aligned themselves with the Communist Party in China, who actually had direct communication and learned from Chinese communists, one of the first things the Chinese communists did was educate the Panthers and these organizations how to protect the community from drugs. So you're telling me they're selling the drugs to get you addicted to drugs, and yet the communists are educating you how to clean yourself up from drugs. They were teaching them traditional Chinese methods like acupuncture, how to get off heroin. These are the skills that they were learning, that they were applying in the community. And this is what Malcolm was doing before the Panthers. And this is what made Malcolm so dangerous, because one, not only was he successfully, especially with his work through the Nation of Islam, where he learned this method to go out to the community to clean people up from drugs, but actually cleaned him up and got him clean. But he's cleaning up the drug users, something that right now, if you listen to the narrative, where they're doing the same thing, blaming China for fentanyl, blaming the communists for the drug problem, but no accountability for cleaning people up and getting them off the drugs. Malcolm's doing that.
They're also blaming Venezuela now for fentanyl while they're bombing and killing people. And when everyone knows that this is completely bogus, there's no fentanyl coming from Venezuela to the United States. This is an excuse to wage war on Venezuela. I mean, this is a good thing is, less people believe this crap, but they keep on doing it. They keep on doing the same blame game. Every accusation is a confession.
Confession, without a doubt. If we can go back to that, I want to read this document. We're going to have to, I'm doing my research on it. It's going to deserve a deep dive, but I'll just go through one more. I could just go through this whole document. There's so much in here, but I'm not. But the point, the next line that they say, again, they're blaming Latin America, Canada, Mexico. They say leaders of this group, and they're talking about this Harlem-based extremist leftist group. Leaders of this group and other far-left organizations supporting Cuba and China conferred with Malcolm X on several occasions after he bolted the Black Muslims a year ago from his own Negro nationalist outfit, according to a reliable report under investigation by the FBI and the CIA. They claim, we're going to trust them, the Reds paid at least part of the tab for Malcolm X's tour of Africa and Europe and the Middle East. The plan apparently was to use him as a tool to exploit race problems in the US, as if anyone living in the US needs anyone to exploit them for the race problems that they're engaged in, as if they need someone to tell them or wake them up or make them any more angry. But somehow the Chinese are going to make things worse by getting Malcolm X to exploit the race problems in the US, anti-something as propaganda, weaponized against America. But Malcolm's...
Well, they're still doing that today, by the way. They're still blaming China for weaponizing race issue in United States through quote unquote TikTok. They're still blaming it. They're still saying it's a Chinese, and Russian disinformation campaign to whip up all the BLM, Black Lives Matters, and all these protests. That was all due, and all the pro-Palestinian voices. That is all a Chinese and Russian plot. I mean, they're still saying this, including Hillary Clinton. Clinton just recently said that in an interview. It's China is doing disinformation campaign through TikTok, as if these problems, like people in United States otherwise would not even notice these problems.
I mean, the playbook hasn't changed a single bit, and that's why critical analysis of the past is so important. The study of history is so important. By studying history, you will find the blueprint, and this is exactly what Malcolm X talked about when he said, "History is most qualified to reward our research." And that quote is plastered on posters all throughout the Black community, and a lot of people, they mistake that quote as simply Malcolm reminding people to study Black history or African history. That wasn't what he was saying. If you read the whole quote, he was saying world history, all of history, and specifically comparative analysis. That is, study the history of other people and study your history. The actual full context of the quote, when Malcolm X says history is most qualified to reward your research, he was referencing the previous paragraph, which he was talking about Chinese history. He just talked about Chinese history for 10 minutes, and he's telling you, you have to study this stuff to liberate your mind. And so one of the traps is they put us in silos, and they give us a watered down version of our own history, and we're obsessed thinking that we only have to study our own narrow history, and then you miss the full context, and you end up being at odds with your own allies and making them into an enemy. I'm gonna let's put this down, because I will get a little bit frustrated and furious as I go through this. This is going to deserve a lot of time and attention to parse out all of the messaging here. But this is basically the crux and some of the key information. I actually have a lot more. I've been investigating this for quite some time, and I'm working on pulling together the Chinese sources. So 2 keys to the puzzle that I'm missing are the Chinese sources. And this video here, before we go to the volume on it, this is what Malcolm would say if he was alive today. This is what Malcolm, how he truly felt about China, and that it applies to our current situation.
Well, I think it's one of the greatest things that has ever happened, because up until now, the nuclear devices have been in the hands of Europeans. They've exercised a monopoly over the nuclear weapons, or over the ability to produce nuclear weapons. But now the Chinese have evened it. They've equalized it by being successful, by being a non-white or non-European nation, and at the same time developing successfully the ability to produce nuclear weapons. So as far as I'm concerned, it was a very good thing, and I do hope that they're able to build bigger ones and better ones every day, because the only language that the European powers understand is the language of power. And a dark nation has to be in a position to talk or speak the language that these imperialists understand. And China has developed the ability to be in that position. And as long as she can speak the language that they understand, it's better for the other dark. They used to have a saying that one doesn't have a Chinaman's chance. But they don't say that anymore. They used that expression back when China was weak. But now, since Mao Zedong has been successful in making China a strong country, the Chinese have more chance than anybody else. So this thing has become outdated. Well, just as it took a strong China to give a Chinese person respect wherever that Chinese person is found on this earth, when we get a strong Africa, the person of African origin or African ancestry will be respected any place on this earth, even in America. But he will not be respected in America until Africa is strong, just as the Chinaman wasn't respected abroad until China became strong.
Remix. Yeah, that's Malcolm Max's own voice over the recent Chinese victory parade. Yeah.
That's literally the fire that engulfs the flame of the Iron Mic, that fuels the passion in my heart, and the reason I came to the People's Republic of China for that message that he was delivering there that really encapsulates Malcolm X's views on China. He was pro-China, 10 toes down, 1,000%. He knew exactly what he was saying, who he was speaking to. He understood who the Communist Party of China is, their role in society and the world. And he promoted when China got the atomic bomb and nuclear weapons and was able to stand up to this imperialist white supremacist power that's still in power today. So he was anti-Taiwan. He realized that Taiwan is the same place as Israel. It's the same state. He was pro, one China policy. He expressed that explicitly, and his message has been watered down, and his connection to China has been watered down because it's a threat. It's a threat, and they don't want people like myself to have a proper understanding of China's political significance in the world. And God forbid you have an actual people-to-people relationship or connection with folks in China. And so I really think that's an apt way to end the conversation with the words of Malcolm X. Very powerful. I believe if he was alive today, this is exactly what he would have said, seeing the commemoration of the ending of the war against fascism, the anniversary of the conclusion of the war against fascism that just took place a couple months ago in Beijing, where the multipolar powers got together, the multipolar world powers got together in Beijing to make a strong, bold statement that there is power on this planet outside of Western imperialism and white supremacy.
Well said. Well said. And on that note, if people want to follow you, Dana, where would they go?
Yeah, just check right here below, Detroit Showtime on Twitter, on X. That's the one place you can find me. They keep suppressing me, blocking my account. If you know, please give me a follow if you appreciate anything I said here. You can find a lot of the stuff that I talked about. I've done deep dives on my Twitter page, so you can just search for the topics that you're interested in on my Twitter page to see the research. And I appreciate all of the follows and retweets because my account is a bit suppressed. So if you retweet my work, it helps boost me and get me visible. But I appreciate that.
Thank you, Dana. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Until next time. Bye-bye.